Okay, turning now to the final topic for this lecture, which is social variables. So what have we seen so far? Well, we've seen the idea that there is variation, right? There are different idiolects, different styles, different dialects, and we've seen what kinds of linguistic features vary. Basically, anything at any level of language, from the phonetics through to the semantics, can potentially vary. So that's interesting, but we're ready now to look at maybe what's the most interesting question in sociolinguistics, which is what is it that governs that variation? What determines when you decide to use one variant or another? So, for example, what determines whether somebody says, the test was pretty hard, or the test was so hard? That's another kind of variation. In fact, here it's actually usually gender that determines the choice. Or what determines whether somebody says, I don't want any, or I don't want none? The answer in cases like this is usually social factors. Particular variants are used by particular kinds of people in particular contexts. And that's where sociolinguistics gets really interesting, right? Figuring out who says what and when they say it and why they say it. So a social variable, this is a social factor that can vary in some way, and the variation correlates with some kind of linguistic variation. So we're going to look at 6 social variables: age, location, socioeconomic status, gender, identity, and the speech context. I'll give some quick examples to illustrate each of these, and then the next lecture we'll look at some case studies that illustrate these variables and how they work together in more detail. So first, speaker's age. So an example to illustrate this is what's called quotative like. So I'm sure you've heard things like, I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, trust me. Where what that means traditionally is, I said, are you sure? And he said, trust me. So it's a way of introducing quotations using the word like, and this is spread across most of the English-speaking world in the past couple generations. Since it's a relatively new feature, you only find younger speakers using it. So your grandparents probably don't use like in this way. Another example is what's called quotative all. So this would be, I was all, are you sure? And he was all, trust me. This is a bit less common than quotative like. It's also newer than quotative like. So quotative all, it originated in California in the 80s, and its use peaked in the 1990s, and it kind of isn't used so much anymore. So the people who use quotative all the most frequently seem to be people who were teenagers around the 90s when it was at its peak. Okay, so again, your age determines which variable you use, or which variant you use. The major reason why we often find a correlation between age and between particular variants is that language is always changing. Okay, so it's just a fact that language changes from generation to generation, but people don't keep changing the way they talk. Okay, for most people, you keep on talking the way you spoke when you reached adulthood. So by the time you get to age 20 or so, that's the way you're going to talk for the rest of your life. Not completely, but for the most part. So what that means is that if some new innovation arises, say in a high school in California, and starts to spread, only people who are at that age and younger will use it, because the older people aren't going to go back and revise their language in most cases. Again, maybe sometimes they will, but usually they don't. So what we end up with then, we end up with a pattern where one generation uses some particular variant, and then another generation doesn't. Okay, so the use of the variant correlates with age. Another example of this is the meaning of the word awesome. Okay, so this is a semantic variable. So there was a study done in England, in Sheffield, on what meaning or what different meanings people could use or people could have for the word awesome. So 3 different meanings were identified. There was the meaning. The oldest meaning, the one that's in green here, it means terrible, right? As in awe-inspiring. Okay? So an awesome difficulty would mean a very terrible difficulty. And if you see on the graph, only people over 60 used awesome with that meaning. Okay, so that's a very old meaning that young people don't have at all. The other 2 meanings, there's a meaning impressive. which means, wow, you got into Harvard. That's awesome, right? So that's something that's very, very impressive. And if you look at it, so even the older people have that meaning, right? That's the one that's in purple. There's another meaning, which is just great. Okay, so that's when you use awesome, not because you think something is super impressive, but you just say it's just a kind of another way of saying great. So yeah, I'm free tomorrow. Let's meet. Awesome. We'll meet at 2. Right? So I'm not saying that because I think it's really, really amazing that we're going to meet at 2. It's just a way of saying, yeah, that's great. So that's the one in light blue. So if you look at the 3 younger age groups, you see that the people under 18 use awesome to mean great almost all the time. The people from 31 to 60 don't use awesome to mean great very often. People over 60 hardly have that meaning at all. And the people from 19 to 30 are in between. Right? So we have a clear difference. In each cohort of ages, the younger you get, the more likely you are to use awesome to mean great, rather than to mean impressive or terrible. Second social variable is speaker's location. Right? So as I'm sure you're aware, the way a person speaks depends on where they've lived, and in particular, where they grew up. And we already talked about this, actually. So variation that correlates with location, we have a name for this. This is called dialect variation. So while in question, why does this exist? Why do languages have dialects? Why do people in different areas speak differently? Well, dialects usually arise over time for a variety of factors. So as a case study, let's look at how Newfoundland English, which is a very distinct dialect or set of dialects, how did that arise? How did people who live there end up speaking differently from people in the rest of Canada? So the dialects spoken in Newfoundland have distinct phonology from the rest of Canada. So most Canadians would say think and this, whereas Newfoundlanders typically say tink and dis. Okay, so the interdental fricatives have been replaced with alveolar stops. There's also distinct lexicon. So for example, the plural you, there's a word ye that's used there, as in, for example, did ye see Lucy? Meaning, did you all see Lucy? Just another example, there's this phrase the once, which means soon. So I'll do that the once, which means I'll do that sometime soon. There's also distinct syntax. So in standard Canadian English, we could say something like, I have talked to Lucy. This is, if you remember back to morphology, this is the perfect. In Newfoundland, you could say, to express the same thing, you could say, I'm after talking to Lucy, which means I have talked to Lucy. This is actually an import from Irish English. Okay, this is called the after perfect. So lots of ways in which those dialects are different from the rest of Canada. Why? Okay, where do those differences come from? So some of the reasons, one is settlement. And so Newfoundland was settled mainly by people who came from 2 particular areas of England and Ireland. If you compare that to Canada, the rest of Canada was settled from people from all over, right? All over England, all over Scotland and Ireland, and then after that, people from all over Europe, and then after that, people from all over the world, right? So when you have all this variation and diversity, that causes unique features to sort of get averaged out or leveled out. Whereas in a place that's only got a couple of different settler inputs, you're more likely to preserve particular unique features. Another factor is geographical isolation, right? So Newfoundland is an island, so it's naturally protected, if you will, from outside influences, so less likely to take part in language changes that happen elsewhere. And then political isolation is another factor. So Newfoundland was a separate country from Canada until quite relatively recently, so there was no reason why people there would want to sound like Canadians. Okay. So because of factors like this, Newfoundland didn't participate in the same linguistic changes that led to modern Canadian English. It just kind of went on its own way. And I mean, this isn't unique to Newfoundland English. This is just an example, but factors such as settlement patterns, geographical location, isolation, political factors, political borders, and so on, these are typically responsible for people ending up speaking in different ways. So this is where dialects come from. Third social variable is socio-economic status. also known as class. Okay, so we can divide people into classes based often on occupation. So a set of classes is often used when talking in sociolinguistics. The upper middle class, this is well-educated professionals who've done a lot of schooling and who have very comfortable incomes. So people like doctors, lawyers, architects. Lower middle class would be educated professionals who make more like average incomes. So people like teachers or nurses or managers. Then below that, we would have the upper working class. So people who work what we would consider not so much professional jobs, but wage jobs that require less education. So like, for example, clerks in retail businesses. And then lower working class, these would be people working, again, wage jobs, but with lower pay and with less job security. So people like manual laborers, for example, who are hired to do short-term jobs. Now, it might not seem very nice to put people in boxes like this, right? To classify people like this. But the fact is that in our society, we do this, right? We regard certain professions and by extension, certain people as being better than other professions and other people. And I mean, that isn't nice, but that's a fact of our society and of many societies. And these class distinctions turn out they do play a really, really big role in linguistic variation. So an example of a feature that's sensitive to class, if you take a sentence like X is Y, so there's the verb to be, right, which is realized as is in this example, is that verb actually spoken? So in standard English, yes, you say she is my sister. The term for that verb to be in this context is called a copula. Okay, so we might use that term as we talk about this. There's a non-standard variant. Rather than saying she is my sister, there are people who say she my sister. Not so common in Canada, but you've probably heard this on TV. Right? You're probably aware that there are people who talk this way. This is also called zero copula because you're just not using the verb to be at all if you say she my sister. So there was a study done in Detroit in the percentage of time that people use the zero copula, the non-standard variant. So you look at this graph. On the y-axis, we've got the percentage of use of the non-standard. Okay, so how often do people use the zero copula? And then along the x-axis, we've got the class. So the highest class is on the left, and the lowest class is on the right. Right? So as we go from left to right, we go down and down in terms of socioeconomic status. And what you see from the lines is that the use of the zero copula goes up and up. Right? So the upper middle class, they're between 0 and 10%. So they don't use it very often. Whereas if you go to the lower working class, they use it 50% and up. Right? So much, much more often. So in Detroit, your class is a really strong predictor of whether you'll say she is my sister or she my sister. You see there's also a difference here between men and women. We're going to talk about gender shortly. There's a particular pattern that we often find when we have a variable that's conditioned by class. So here's some variant that's prestigious, right? So not like the previous graph, which was a non-prestige, but some variant that's considered to be good. So what you see here is that the upper middle class, the highest class, uses that variant a lot. The lower working class, the lowest class, they don't use it very much. The upper working class uses it a bit more. And then if you look at the second highest class, the lower middle class, what we see here is that they're using the prestige variant even more than the highest class does. So in terms of their speech, the lower middle class is actually reaching higher than the upper middle class. So think for a second, why might that be? What might the social reason be for someone in the lower middle class to speak even more standardly than someone in the upper middle class? What might be the motivation for that? I'm actually not going to give you an answer right now, but in the case study lecture, we'll come back and talk about this pattern again. Right? But this is a class-based pattern that we often find. The second highest class often uses the prestige variant even more than the highest class does.